Thank you, Madam Chair. As a former school board member who survived the Great Recession, and as the new chair of the Subcommittee on Education, I am very pleased with the governor's two particular aspects of the governor's proposal. One is his commitment to his ongoing commitment to restore the cuts to our schools that have been made since 2008, both in the K through 12 area as well as in the higher ed area. And two, his commitment to pay down the debt and to strengthen the rainy day reserve fund. Because, as a former school board member, I had to deal with the implementation of the devastating state budget cuts. I had to run into the parents in the grocery store who's confronting me about why their child's class size is dramatically increasing. I have to face the teacher who's getting the pink slip as we're laying off teachers. And so I know first and foremost what our schools want is a stable source of funding, and that given all the systemic problems in our budget process, as Mr. Taylor indicated, one of our first priorities should be to strengthen the rainy day fund so that we can level out these boom and bust cycles, provide a stable source of funding for our schools. And so I look forward to working with the governor and my colleagues in the legislature on those two priorities. Having said that, I'd like to address two concerns related to the Subcommittee on Education. One is in the area of K through 12, and two in the area of higher education. First, on the K through 12 area, the governor is proposing this continuous appropriation to the local control funding formula, where a set percentage of Prop 98 funding would be automatically allocated to the LCFF. Now, whenever I see a new formula for funding, it makes me nervous, because I know that part of the systemic problems with our funding system is that we have too many formulas that lock us in, whether it's the ballot box budgeting, and do we need, this appears to be like a Prop 98 within a Prop 98. So, what are the problems with, why should the legislature approve yet another formulaic funding formula for K through 12? That's my first question. My second question is that, again, I'm very pleased that the governor is proposing, as part of his 4-year plan, to continue to restore funding for our higher education segments, including the UCs and the CSUs. But I'm concerned about how the governor is excluding any enrollment target for the UCs and the CSUs. Shouldn't Californians expect that if we're going to be giving more money to the UCs and the CSUs, that more California students will be able to get into the UC schools, get into the CSUs, get into the community colleges? Shouldn't we require an enrollment target to go along with the increased funding?
Sure. I'll take the LCFF question first. I think, so the LCFF, really one of the main underpinnings that was discussed last year when it was enacted was really actually to simplify and not to make more complicated the schools funding. We were able to collapse over 40 individual programs that had all different requirements that school districts had to comply with. I'm sure you had experience with that in your role on the board. So I think that was the intention of LCF, among other things. And I think our follow-up proposal this year to propose a continuous appropriation for the LCFF is just to provide school districts more certainty than they already have, than they have now, in order to plan for the amount of money that they're going to get They have to do, as you know, planning. At the same time, we're up here debating a budget, and so I think by providing that continuous appropriation, that gives them some certainty that they can count on and plan for. In terms of the enrollment target, I think our approach on higher education, which has not included enrollment targets, which we understand is a departure from how historically the universities have been governed. But I think the reason why is because we really want the universities to focus on success with the students that they have. We really would like them to increase their enrollment, but if they're only getting students through in 6, 7, 8 years, and some of that is because, I think we've all heard the stories about students not being able to get a class, and so that adds another semester or another year to the time it takes them to get to degree. And I think we really want the universities to think holistically about how they can efficiently get students to degrees faster with still a very high-quality education. We don't want to diminish that at all, but we do want them to think about how to be more efficient with the resources they have. And if they do that, they should be able to increase enrollment, and that's really what our approach is underpinned by.
Apologies. I have on the list Mr. Chesbro, Mr. Jones Sawyer, Mr. Daly, Bloom, Ting, Mullen, Melendez, Weber. Okay, so Mr. Chesbro.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I have questions about the developmental services budget and also the governor's proposal for the infrastructure financing districts. But first, let me say that to make you feel a little bit better, Madam Chair, a few of us in this room, maybe I might be the only one on the dais, but certainly Keely and some other people out there were here when we did a round of cuts 10 years ago, some of which were never restored. So on the one hand, that lays the groundwork for being fully aware of what Keely said to us about being aware of the almost inevitable cycle that will lead us to another recession. So I think practicing restraint is good advice and one that we ought to need to keep in mind throughout this process. On the other hand, there are many areas that are critical key core services for the people of the state that have been decimated, and some of them, very few of them, were decimated twice and never restored. And the one that I'm particularly concerned about today is the services to the developmentally disabled. We cut those programs the last time around 10 years ago, and then they essentially were frozen. And then in this most recent budget crisis, we have further decimated the services of those people who are so completely dependent on the state government and who were perceived to have legally a entitlement through the Lanterman Act. And so I'm pleased that the governor has proposed some restoration and begun, steps in the right direction. But I'd like to hear those restorations detailed a little bit here today, and also whether or not the governor is envisioning a pathway towards rebuilding, assuming that we don't hit the recession this year or next year, but are in a recovery mode for some time, whether an understanding that we have both under the Lanterman Act, but also under the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Supreme Court rulings, an obligation to provide community services to persons with disabilities that were very vulnerable from a legal standpoint. It's quite amazing that the state hasn't been sued successfully to date on those based on both federal and state legislation and also the U.S. Supreme Court ruling. So could you talk both about the governor's proposal in this area and also whether there's as part of any larger vision of how we move forward with restoring the services to persons with disabilities?
Yeah, I'll start out, and then I'm going to turn it over to Teresa Calvert for the details. But the governor is committed to the state's entitlement system for persons that are living with developmental disabilities. And specifically, last year we took a very large step to really close the developmental centers to new admissions, really placing the emphasis on serving these individuals in the community where they can be have the most access to a normal life and not be in an institution. So I
But
think,
they need the services.
but they need the services. We agree with you. And so, I just want to start off with that commitment, and then we do have a few items in the budget.
Good morning, Teresa Calvert with the Department of Finance. The Department of Developmental Services budget has a few significant adjustments. We, along with adjusting for normal caseload as we do every year, we have some funding for federal labor regulations and minimum wage, which will affect provider rates, and so we have adjusted in the budget for that, and that is to the tune of about $7.5 million for the federal labor regulations and about $100 million total funds for the minimum wage adjustment. We also have funding in the deferred maintenance category for developmental centers, and that's about $10 million, and that's part of the overall deferred maintenance proposal that we put forward for $100 million for various departments. Another significant area in which we are focusing is the certification issues surrounding the developmental centers. So we have funding to help Sonoma work its way through the existing decertification on the path to getting recertified, and we assume that happens by July 1st of 2014. Also on the certification news front, we have the department has recently signed and has approved with the Federal Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services program improvement plans for the Fairview, Lanterman, and Porterville centers. So that is a recent update to the decertification issues surrounding those centers.
Thank you. And so, given that that's all good news, especially with regards to the minimum wage and federal labor requirements. But also at the heart of my question is the fact that the array of services and the amount of money that's available per client for who lives in the community that was significantly eroded, and there was some recovery last year in that. But I'm trying to create a larger context of whether or not there's an understanding that there continues to be a larger problem and that we're on a pathway towards assuming the money's there and we're not going backwards fiscally again, trying to get back to, at least back to where we were in terms of the array of services that people were entitled to before the last budget crisis froze them and then further eroded them in this budget crisis.
I think we absolutely continue to monitor what's going on out in the community. This is obviously still a changing. I mean, it continues to evolve with the autism spectrum and many other issues that continue to change in this area. And so, of course, we continue to monitor it. But again, we're very concerned about committing what we believe are one-time revenues for any kind of ongoing expansions that we would have to.
Well, I started out acknowledging the necessity of prudence and caution, so I don't think, but you can count on me to put I'm putting a marker on it now and through the budget process to be, and I know there are others in our caucus and also over on the Senate side who feel, as I do, very strongly that it's that we're going to have to examine this and try to think what we can do this year, and then also should we have the resources, understanding that we need to be on a pathway towards restoration. Other area that I have a real interest in is the governor's proposal for infrastructure financing districts. Understandably, and again, I'm expressing an understanding of the governor's perspective, after having completely eliminated redevelopment, he's being very restricted in terms of where and how the IFDs are proposed to be used. And I don't expect him to be willing to throw the doors wide open, but I'm sort of testing in terms of exactly where the boundaries are and that how open and flexible the administration is going to be, because I think what I've seen initially in the budget is pretty restrictive, and I think getting back to what redevelopment originally was intended to do, which was to address blight and to eliminate blight and turn it into positive economic activity. There are very specific examples, certainly in my district and around the state, and so I'm hopeful that the administration's open to examining exactly how the definition is, so that when we pass the budget in June, we can, or do something legislatively, we get this right.
Yes, I'm going to turn this over to my colleague to outline the details of our infrastructure financing district proposal. But I will say that the dissolution of redevelopment has been something that this administration has been committed to, and it continues to be a significant work. As I mentioned earlier, there continues to be many lawsuits, two of which recently have put about $3 billion of the $7 billion that cities, counties, special districts, and schools have received in jeopardy. $3 billion of the $7 billion. So that continues to be our primary focus, but we do recognize that there are communities with issues that need addressed, and things like the infrastructure financing districts could help to move projects along, and that's really what underpins our proposal. But I'll let David Botello outline that proposal for you.
Good morning. David Botello with the Department of Finance. And as Keely Bosler just described, the goal of the administration's proposal is to provide an alternative method for local governments to address some of the blight concerns and expand on the existing law for infrastructure financing districts. It's already existing in law. It would provide some easier voting requirements at 55% instead of 2/3 of the local affected entities, tax entities, and they would be required to participate in voting and approving and participating, as opposed to the former RDA process, the redevelopment agency process, where the money was just redirected without their input. Right. So it will be a more coordinated effort with the local governments and the taxing entities to determine the priorities of their communities and how those funds will be expended. It does not raise any new taxes. Again, it will function on the growth in property taxes, that tax increment amount of future years resulting from the development in those areas. And it will not affect schools or education this time. None of the money can be used or taken from the allocation to the schools.
But it also has a much narrower definition of the types of projects that would be eligible, certainly than we had available under redevelopment, and also I think under the existing IFD law. So I guess what I'm just trying to ascertain is whether or not there's room for a full discussion on fine-tuning those definitions so that we get the best possible combination of projects that would be eligible.
Yes, I think that our proposal actually does propose to expand the projects that could be considered under IFDs, because I think they were more limited, and so that's one of the big proposals that we have.
Okay, well, I interpret it as a limiting, so we'll have that discussion.
Okay.
Well, I appreciated how you worded the question, but obviously, since we're the ones who adopt the budget, there's lots of room for this discussion. And I would only say, Mr. Chesbrough, that you are not the only member who has come to me personally with the concerns around development of disabilities. But let us go now to Mr. Jones Sawyer, followed by Mr. Daly and Mr. Bloom.
Thank you. And as someone who wasn't here when you had to go through those tough times, I truly appreciate, and a lot of my other colleagues who weren't there making those hard budget cuts. We know now we're probably in a better state because of the hard decisions you had to make before. And so speaking from the viewpoint of a newly elected official who's never had a bad budget, we have to be very, very, probably even more so, fiscally responsible and take it to heart. And so when we talk about spending, and I know people are talking about spending all the time, we probably need to talk about smart spending. And where I really want to get us to is look at spending as investments. And you've probably heard from both of you about how do we move forward so that we start developing plans so that our money spreads a lot longer and further and better. And with that, I have about 3 comments and 1 question. One comment is about the deferred maintenance. Now, just my background, I was director of real estate for the city of Los Angeles. I managed a real small city that had about 1,000 buildings, 40,000 employees. And I know what it's like when you leave your deferred maintenance and you don't take care of your buildings, and your greatest asset, which is your infrastructure, goes down, and you lose that initial investment that you put in. and I think Mr. Dickerson has explained it. And so I probably will ask Subcommittee 4, Mr. Daly, to look into it and ask him to have me help him with it, because I've done infrastructure studies in the Department of General Services. I agree with a lot of my colleagues, Mr. Dickerson. 5 years is way too long to get an infrastructure study done. I probably could do it, but I have to quit my job. But I can definitely get it done in a whole lot sooner than that. And so we need to look at that. And also, Assemblymember Hall and myself are concerned about the Department of General Services, and we probably want to talk to the general manager about the real estate and how things are being managed. And so we may go on a separate track to look at that, because there's some revenue there. There's some ways we can manage things better. We want to work cooperatively with them. If it means an audit, then so be it. But we do need to start to focus. I remember General Services is one of them weird, mysterious departments that nobody really knows what the hell they do. Well, I actually do know what they do, and I want to find out how we can make them do it better. And so hopefully with your cooperation, we can get there. On the matter of courts, which are under my purview, I believe they should get money. I believe they should get as much money as they need to manage these courts, to get those lines down, have people have access to justice. But the key word is manage. And there's got to get some, we have to get some level of comfort working collaboratively together, and that we're not, I'll just say it, we're not screaming third house of government. We're all part of government. These funds they're not with the legislature, they're not with the governor's office, they're not with the court. These are taxpayers' money. The taxpayers want to know how well we're spending the court's money. And if we can help them through audits to do some management studies, some best practices, we might be able to shake out or discover maybe $100, $200 million worth of improvements on how they run the court better. I'm extremely interested in looking at a better structure for managing courts. I think that there's some gold in that will help the courts immensely. However, the only way we're going to do that is all branches are going to have to work together, and we have to figure that out. And if it's an independent group, an independent audit, an independent study, then so be it. We just want to know the truth so we can manage the taxpayers' money better. And then finally, on prison rehabilitation, which is what I have my question, I have a real concern with prison rehabilitation and possibility to be some endangerment of that. As my colleague said earlier, if we were to educate 20,000 people, I believe we could get some revenue of $500,000, which gets us to, billions and billions of dollars worth of revenue for the state. Well, I submit to you, if you drop our prison population from coming back and recidivating by 20,000, you'll get that same kind of return. So we need to do prison reinvestment, investment in rehabilitation. We need to do that, because the amount of money that comes back to the state is immeasurable, and I don't think we're really looking at that. We have a $315 million, $81.1 million to the Recidivism Reduction Fund. So really, my question is, I know we're going back and forth with the 3 federal court judges. Every day I get a blow-by-blow of what's going on. Monday it's rosy, Tuesday it's not so rosy, Wednesday it's falling apart. And so I'm really concerned about that, because there's discussions about another $400 million where we want to put into the 1,700 contracted out beds in-state and out-state, and that's not an investment. That's just putting money down the drain. It's like you can either rent, where you don't get any appreciation, it's not an investment, or you can own, where that asset actually appreciates. I'm trying to get us to invest in our infrastructure, which are people. When I go through the prisons, it is very, very disheartening. It's almost like a prison plantation, and whether it is or isn't, I mean, I can't even go see 12 Years a Slave, because I see it when I go through a prison. People are uneducated, and the prison system is keeping them that way, to keep a whole segment of the population contained in one place. It's a destruction of the family infrastructure and system. because families are totally destroyed. And finally, many of these people remain permanently unemployed. So we need to do this a lot better. And so my question is, does the three-court panel alter the administration's $81 million and the recidivism proposal?
So the direct answer to that question is we don't know yet. We're still awaiting discussions with the court. They're ongoing. There was a recent order that there will be more to come this month from the court. But the governor remains committed to reducing recidivism. I think that is really the key to improving people's lives and really investing in people, as you say. And then that also helps the state to manage its overall prison size and costs, because it is a very large piece of the state's budget. And prisons are expensive. And like you say, they also take people away from their families, their communities, where they may have jobs, and can be very destructive. So I think that, you know, we have the same goals to reduce recidivism, ensure people are not coming back many times over, but still government, you know, has a very core responsibility to incarcerate those persons who have committed especially serious and violent crimes, which is mainly who is in our state prisons now after realignment in AB 109. Significant numbers of offenders are now serving their time locally and staying in their communities instead of going to a prison in Susanville or Blythe or the other far-flung places that our prisons are.
Arizona.
Yeah, yes, and we do still continue to maintain those out-of-state contract beds, which are necessary right now for us to continue to try and meet the prison population cap that the courts have set for us. But I'm going to turn it over to Amy for additional details on the proposals related to recidivism reduction.
Sure. Good morning. Amy Jarvis with the Department of Finance. We have proposed investments in recidivism reduction. In addition, we also, total rehabilitative programs, we have about a little over $400 million proposed in this governor's budget. The $81.1 million that was the savings that we expect from the $350 million appropriation from SB 105, which was necessary, as Ms. Bosler mentioned, to meet our population cap. That $81 million in savings, we are proposing for reentry programs. The first piece is $40 million for reentry beds, and we kind of left it open to hopefully see what types of programs are available out there in the community to help with reentry type services. And so I think we left it vague and open intentionally, because we're not sure that we've tapped all of the markets out there in terms of what services might be available to help reintegrate offenders into the community and reduce recidivism. We have about $11 million to add another 300 treatment slots for ISMIP, the Integrated Services for Mentally Ill Parolees program. Those are community treatment programs. They provide wraparound services from education to job training, even housing, and also finding people job placements. So that's another investment that we're making. We are also proposing to reactivate the Northern California, formerly the Northern California Women's Facility, as a reentry hub. Another institution, about 600 beds, and it would be added to the reentry type services, again, intensive treatment and programming before offenders are released back into the community. We're also proposing, right now we have 13 reentry hubs in the state prison system, and that was something we had proposed as part of our blueprint. We are also proposing to institute the substance abuse treatment programs at our non-reentry hubs, and that would provide services that complement another proposal in the budget that is a general fund program, and it's for drug interdiction. So we want to identify the drugs within the prisons and then do something to control the continued use of illicit drugs in the system. And so we're proposing to expand those substance abuse treatment slots to all prisons. And then the last thing is in all of the in-state contract facilities, to further the goals of our programming and reentry services, is to make sure that our in-state contract facilities are also positioned to be able to provide reentry services to the offenders serving their time in a contract facility.
And I'll say something real quick.
Sure.
So this is my view of the world. My first year budget put $7.5 million in the budget for a rehabilitation program in one of the prisons. The governor saw fit to cut it. Within a month or two, he's fined $715 million to incarcerate people. I don't know where he found that money at, but we should be able to find money for rehabilitation. So not only should we not cut that, and we should support that, but we need to do more. That's all I'm saying.